Waterfall cards are such a wow factor mechanism and they can look really daunting, but I find them really easy to use once I've done this once or twice. Now with this tips and tricks video, you're going to learn the mistakes not to make when you create your first waterfall card, or maybe you've been making them for a while and you can't work out why they don't quite go right. And hopefully this is the video for you. Now don't forget to like, subscribe and share this with your crafty friends, and let's get on with the tutorial. So the first thing to note is that I don't measure and score and cut my mechanism by hand. I tend to use my Cricut machine. Now I've got the Cricut Joy and this is absolutely perfect for this type of mechanism. So what I have is it's just a handmade design in Cricut Design Space, simply 4 squares of equal sizes, and this is really important. I then have 4 squares slightly smaller, really easy to do within Cricut Design Space, and these are for my mats and layers. And then the mechanism is simply this T shape, which I've just generated by creating a rectangle the same width as the squares, but then obviously much longer, and then with this T shape at the bottom. And this bar can be adapted to be as thick and as wide as you want it to be. Now the beauty of me doing it with the Cricut machine as opposed to buying some dies, we have got some fabulous dies on CraftStash. If you prefer to go down the die cutting route, you can do it with a template as well. I know we've got a waterfall template on Craftworld you can download and use, but if you go to the machine, you can then keep that design and you can resize it to use it over and over again in different sizes for different cards. It's really easy as well to cut your mats and layers that way, and it's also really easy to add tabs if you want more pages. So I would definitely look at doing it with your digital machine as opposed to a die or a template, but that's a preference. Now this is the easiest type of waterfall card that I've found to make, because it is simply your tabs and one part to the mechanism, like I say, this T-shaped part. So the mechanism here needs some score lines in, and this is adjustable as well. So if you want to add more tabs, it's really simple to do that. So I'm going to bring in a scoreboard to the tab that I've created. And if you are creating this either on a digital cutting machine or using a template, I would suggest make this even longer, make it as long as possible and trim it down later, because it won't hurt to do it that way. If you create this too short, you're just going to have to restart the whole project again. So now we're going to add some score lines into our mechanism bar. So we'll call this the bar throughout the video. And at this point, we're going to want to make the steps between each of the waterfall pieces. So I would suggest here, my top tip is not to make these too close together. Otherwise the mechanism can get quite jammed up. I would say at least kind of 1/2 centimetre minimum for each of these. So on my scoreboard, I'm working in inches, and it's around about 1/4 of an inch. And you're going to want to make sure you've got enough for the amount of tabs that you've chosen to create. Now my next tip, and something that I never used to do, and it does make a huge difference, is when you fold along those score lines, ensure you're folding both backwards and forwards. Again, this makes a difference. This is just going to add flexibility to your mechanism. It's going to make sure that you can easily roll that piece of cardstock, this bar, up and down, and it kind of has to go round a corner as such. That's what part of the mechanism does. So you want to ensure you've got this roll effect. So just by folding backwards and forwards, you're just making sure that you're going to have that flexibility within the fibers of the paper. So there we should have, I'm doing 4 squares, so I should have 4 little lines, and you should be able to see that they roll quite nicely. So just place your mechanism on your card. So what you're going to want to do is have the T-bar, the bar at the front, then you've got your score lines, and I've left around about 1.5 inches, maybe 3 centimetres or so, a little bit more than that, from the bottom of the bar to the first score line. This is going to depend on whether you want to have the base of your first square directly at the bottom, or whether you're happy to have it overlap. I quite like to have it overlap, and then I glue this one down, and that kind of just hides the mechanism there. So this bottom one will be static. So that also gives me the flexibility of adjusting this height if I want to. So this really is a card where the mechanism, the score lines, the cut lines, they don't have to be that accurate. Okay, you can just kind of play with the measurements if you want to suit your card front. So with your mechanism folded up as if it was closed, you can lay this on your card base now and you can work out whereabouts you'd like your mechanism to sit. Bear in mind you're going to have your tabs, if I put the top and the bottom one on, sitting like so, how high up you'd like that to come and where you need your bottom tab that you're going to pull to finish. So I can now cut this off to around about here. Like I said earlier, when I'm using the Cricut Joy and I'm designing the shapes simply with rectangles and squares, that's all I use. I like to make sure that this part is longer than I'm going to need, and this gives me the flexibility to do this with. So now I can trim that, and I would suggest now my next top tip is to create any design here, whether it's with a shaped die or a punch. Maybe you want to do this in advance in your electronic cutting machine. I'd like to add a tassel as well, so I'm going to put a hole in there. So all of this detail I'm going to do now before I glue it down. So once my mechanism is kind of designed there, I'm not going to glue anything just yet. I am now also going to decorate my panels, or at least put the mats and layers on. Now, like I say, my mats and layers were created really simply by taking these squares in my Cricut design space and just making 4 squares ever so slightly smaller. This is a really quick and easy way of doing it. So once you have your waterfall squares ready and you also have your mechanism ready, we can start adhering this to our card base. And of course, don't forget, if you want to mat and layer your card base first of all. Now I'm going to keep this nice and simple. I'm not going to finish off the decoration on this because I just want to show you the mechanism. But if you are going to be using wet glue on any of your elements, as I did with my mats and layers here, ensure they are completely dry before you start putting your mechanism together. And this brings me to my next tip. So I would strongly suggest that you use a tape for your mechanism rather than a wet glue, because if you start putting a wet glue in your mechanism, things are going to stick where they don't want to. So the first thing I'm going to do is glue down the 2 tabs on the T-bar here. Now it's really easy to cover these over later on if you want to, so don't stress about those if they're the wrong colour for your cardstock. If in doubt, create the mechanism the same colour as your base card, but I've done this a different colour so it's easy for you to see. Now all you're going to want to do is put a little bit of glue just on the 2 tabs at the side, just making sure that you've got no adhesive in this area, because the back piece is going to be coming up and down here. So you want to only be putting your tape on the tabs. Like I say, if you are using a Cricut Design Space or another cutting machine program, you can easily make these tabs much longer or much deeper if that's your preference. Red liner tape is my favourite tape to use. It's really super strong. It's ideal for construction and mechanisms like this. And of course, CraftStash have a huge range of red liner tape, usually some fantastic bundle deals as well, and lots of various widths. So we're just going to turn our mechanism over and pop down the 2 tabs there. Now this is the beauty of not using a wet glue. We don't need to wait for this to dry. We can test our mechanism works right now. So I'm going to pull, and you should get that curve at the top until the last mechanism or the last square would be revealed, and then it rolls up again. And it's this movement that we wanted the flexibility in those score lines for. That will become much more fluid once we get our squares on there. And again, I'm going to use my red liner tape to adhere my squares. Now, this is where you just need to plan in advance which red liner tape you're going to use, or which adhesive you're going to use, because the width of it is important. You don't want the width to be any wider than the squares you've scored. There we go. So ensuring that none of these tapes are overlapping here, and then you know you should be good with your glue sitting in the correct place. So we're going to release the bottom one first and work our way up, because this one will go underneath everything else. You want to make sure your last tab is in line with the top of the mechanism. You don't want that to be any higher or any lower. we can now we can pull our tab and we can see that waterfall effect happening, which is really pretty. So just as you fold it, just reinforce each of those score lines again, making sure everything folds up and down nicely and pushes back. So there we have our mechanism. So there's lots of tips and tricks there for you to take away and start creating your perfect waterfall mechanisms. Now everything that I've used to create this, including my Cricut Joy machine, my cardstock, my card bases, and of course the adhesive, I've all bought from CraftStash, because CraftStash is the one-stop shop for everything you need for crafting, and also of course they do have their best price guarantee. Now if you are a VIP member at CraftStash, don't forget you're going to save 10% on all your purchases. You'll get things like double points and priority dispatch also, so it's well worth looking in to the CraftStash VIP membership. You can find that at www.craftstash.co.uk/VIP. Thank you so much for joining me, everybody. If you like tutorials like this and you'd like to see more, please do subscribe to the CraftStash YouTube channel, and I hope to see you again very soon.